Hi there, John Moore here, and I am a shamanic teacher and practitioner living in the state of Maine in the US, in the northeast part of the US. Today, I want to talk to you a little bit about Celtic shamanism. And the reason I want to talk to you about this is I did a video previously talking about the universality of shamanism, how we find it in almost every culture in the world. I think there was a survey of over 400 cultures, and they found shamanistic practices in over 90% of them, right? And there are anthropological arguments to be made that there are shamanic roots to every spiritual belief or every spiritual system, every religion, and that we see evidence of shamanism practiced in Neolithic times from cave paintings on walls and all these things. So there's this universality to shamanism practiced all over the world at different times, different cultures, that sort of thing. Yes, the word shamanism was not, or shaman was not always used to describe what we now term shamanic practices, but I will get into what shamanic practice, shamanic worldview, that sort of thing can be applied. So the reason I want to talk to you about this is I did this video talking about the universality of shamanism, and I mentioned and I demonstrated a hoop drum from Ireland that was the same as a hoop, very similar to a hoop drum that might be used by Native Americans. This is very similar to a hoop drum that is used in the Middle East, right? So this is a common instrument, tool, commonly used by shamanic cultures all over. And the reason for that was somebody had told me that I was performing cultural appropriation by using a hoop drum when I taught shamanism. And I said, well, no, I mean, I come from cultures where hoop drums are very common. So anyway, somebody took me to task because I mentioned Celtic shamanism and said something along the lines of, you should not use Celtic shamanism as the cornerstone of your argument describing the universality of shamanism, because there are people in Ireland who feel that the term Celtic shamanism is colonial and that it involves beliefs that are imported into Ireland and that are sold to people who are trying to make connections to their roots. It's an interesting argument, and I don't think that I don't completely disagree with it. First of all, yeah, there are people who believe all kinds of things, people in Ireland and people in wherever, and people in the United States who believe that the only shamanism comes from Siberia. That's not true, but there may be people who are importing shamanic practices now from other places into Ireland and labeling that, and I don't know. I'm not judging that. But this person went on to attack the historicity or the historical truth of the Celtic people having shamanic practice. And this is where I think factually that, and there can be disagreements among scholars. Some people might say, well, that's not shamanism or that's not shamanism. But I think there's a lot of evidence for shamanic practices among Celtic people. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, being about, a good portion of me comes from Celtic regions of the world. I feel a strong connection to those cultures. My grandfather was 100% Irish, and my other grandfather was Scottish, and so I've got lots of Gaelic speaking people in my family tree. So the complexity of this, the difficulty of looking at this, comes from a number of different places. One, first of all, the Celtic people were not a monoculture. No matter what people have you think, they had commonalities. There were common languages. There were two branches of Celtic languages, and they can talk about people can talk about where those branched off. But one became, Gaelic, and then became, Irish and Scottish, Manx, and something else, and then the other branch became Welsh and some other languages, and there are a bunch of dead languages in there as well. The other thing is that the Celts, we associate the Celts with Ireland significantly because, that was sort of the last bastion, the last place. There's still a strong Celtic identity in Ireland, but the Celts were everywhere. We have, found, archaeological evidence of Celts all throughout Europe. And there's a famous, pot, vase, whatever you want to call it, metalwork with Cernunnos, the Celtic god Cernunnos, on it, that has elephants on it, which could only have been seen in Asia. So either they were trading goods or had some contact with Asia. So the idea that the Celts were this monoculture that never came into contact or adopted ideas from other cultures, that's not true. It's just completely untrue. And we know that the Celts had strong contact with Germanic tribes. We can see overlaps with gods. We can see Roman authors actually confusing Celtic and German tribes at some point. Okay, so that's one problem, is sort of nailing down what Celtic culture, Celtic religious belief is, because it's not a monoculture. Another problem is that Celtic pagan religious belief was passed down orally. So there's not a lot of written records. There are people who are sort of Reconstructionist Druids or what have you, but the records that we have, the written records, come from later times, like Christianity coming in and, having a certain bias, right? Or the Roman and Greek authors writing about, and they had a certain bias as well. Julius Caesar wrote about the Celts in maybe not so flattering terms. However, with that, we do see some references to shamanic worldview, to shamanic practices amongst the Celts. And I'll talk about that in a minute. The other area that we can look at, so we can look at that, we can look at anthropology, or archaeology, and that has challenges as well, because we don't know what we haven't found, and we can only find things that have been preserved, and so we can't reconstruct an entire culture. Unfortunately, we can try. We can spend lifetimes and lifetimes trying to reconstruct culture, but without having written records or being able to talk to people from that culture, we don't 100% know. But there is folklore, and that has been passed down, that has been written down. We know what it is. We know these tales originally passed around orally, but then eventually written down, or sung, poems by the bards and that sort of thing. And we see again things that we might call shamanic in Irish folklore and Irish heroic myth. And not all of these, also in Welsh, we see all over the place. So again, there's some evidence, and I'm going to link in this because, if you're really particularly interested, I'm going to link a couple of things in here. One will be a PhD research that somebody did demonstrating shamanism in Celtic cultures. Somebody did a tremendous amount of PhD research. And I'm going to link another article from a Druidic organization. And I think both of them are fairly well balanced. I'm not just linking them because they support my personal view, because in fact the one from the Druidic site is somewhat critical, somewhat, there's a lot of back and forth. I feel like it's a really well balanced article. But then I want to link the one that is somebody's PhD research, because there are a lot of references in it. And so if you're scholarly, you can go out and look at those references. He quotes a lot of Eliade, who essentially created the main definition of what we consider shamanism. So this is the this is the next problem we have is, what do we define as shamanism? So if I define shamanism as religious practices of people from Siberia, from a particular tribe in Siberia, then no. Clearly, nobody else outside of Siberia has ever practiced shamanism. But that label, the English word shaman, and it is an English word borrowed in from, German and Russian, borrowed in from, the Tungus people of Siberia. And before that, it was, came from some Indo-European root and exists in many different languages, including like Aramaic, including Chinese, Pali, Sanskrit. So this is a word from a dead mother tongue that I would argue underpins and is important and serves a place in many, many, many human cultures, because the word survived. It's important. It's taken on slightly different meanings. It always sort of relates to some religious or spiritual functionary. So yes, there were not people in the Celtic world called shamans, but we know that there were Druids, we know there were bards, we know there were poets. Poets in Celtic culture were actually spiritual figures, some of whom have been credited with the gift of visionary sight. And there's an interesting account. I'd have to look up. Let me see real quick. I'm going to mispronounce this because while I have Celtic ancestors who spoke Gaelic, I do not. But there is a practice called Imbas Forosnai. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Imbas Forosnai, which meant basically great knowledge, poetic talent, inspiration. And that was a practice by poets where they would perform some ritual that involved like chewing some meat and putting it somewhere and doing something, and then entering into a 3-day sleep state, after which the spirit would come over them and they would rattle off a bunch of information, and people would have, I don't know if they wrote it down, but they would have to try to pay attention. They were essentially channeling or doing what you might see in a voodoo practice or in lots of shamanic practice. And I would argue that some of the practices of voodoo are shamanic, because people are using, the definition is an altered state of consciousness, travel in non-ordinary reality, and to deal with helping spirits. And sometimes that means taking them in and allowing them, horsing them, allowing them to use your body to speak or act. Or sometimes it just means channeling power. Now we have lots of, the Celtic idea of the other world relates 100% to non-ordinary reality of the shamans, the lower world, the world tree. In fact, the word druid might go back to might mean something like wise oak, or the wisdom of the trees, or the wisdom. And trees were obviously very important to the Druids back then. Were the Druids shamans? Hard to say. That there might have been, there certainly could have been shamanic practices done by the Druids. It seems like from accounts that there were different specialties, different functions that they might have had. And again, there was 20 years of training to become a Druid, where you'd have to go to like a university and learn, and it was all oral tradition. So we don't have a lot of written records, but it seems very developed and complicated. Now, one of the counter arguments about shamanism is that it is considered archaic, and unfortunately, that has been that's been a label that's been applied to it by scholars. Eliade is one who called it archaic techniques of ecstasy, and archaic meaning old, meaning previous to modern Western Abrahamic religions, maybe. maybe, but that doesn't, archaic doesn't mean immature, not well developed. I mean, I would argue that Celtic spirituality was highly developed. It was a very important part of life. Were there functionaries that were entering into trance and doing spirit travel and dealing with helping spirits? Absolutely, absolutely. And we see records of spirit animals, power animals. We have the fetch, which is a spirit double that walks beside people, and very, very shamanic concepts, very, very shamanic. That, and that's just among sort of the Druids, the ancient Celtic people. Now let's talk a little more recent history. So we'll talk about what has been titled the fairy faith. So even among Christians in the modern, by modern I mean the past couple hundred years, Celtic world, or worlds where there were Celts, the British Isles and Ireland and parts of Europe, there is this thing called the fairy faith, where these people actually believed, or some continue to believe, in a fairy world, and fairies being spirits, sometimes associated with spirits of the dead, not just like the Tinkerbell style fairies of popular culture, but there were people called cunning people who helped deal with fairies, and the fairy realm is also seen as the other world. So there was a really great, famous, really famous. In fact, I have a copy of this book. I'm going to show it to you. Very famous author, W.Y. Evans Wentz, or Walter Yealing Evans Wentz, who wrote about comparative religion, and he wrote a lot about sort of Tibetan stuff and all kinds of stuff all over the world. And he went and actually did ethnographic research. So he went and interviewed people who were of the fairy faith, who believed in people in this region. And this is a great book called The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries. And yeah, I mean, there's lots of accounts of, what people do, how they interact with fairies, all of these things. There's one in particular, and it is drawn out. It's actually drawn out in the PhD research that I'm going to post at the bottom of this, where there's a Christian, I don't know if it's a minister or a priest or what have you, and in his interview he said, when I was a kid, I believed that fairies were real. I still, even though I've become a priest, I still think that they probably exist, and I was sometimes able to enter a state of ecstasy and see the fairy world. And this is a common description, or people falling into a slumber and seeing the fairy world. So the fairy world in shamanic terms is what we call middle world reality. It's a spiritual realm of the world we live in. And ecstatic trance is exactly the textbook definition of shamanic practice. And so even beyond the ancient Celts into the modern days, we still see shamanic practice. Do we see somebody calling themselves a shaman? No. But that doesn't mean, if I play football but call myself a plumber, I'm still playing football. Right? It's just the terms are different. But in English, we unfortunately only have the word shaman to describe this set of practices and this worldview. So we know the worldview of shamanic cultures is animistic, believing that there are spirits in everything, particularly in nature. We know that was true for the Celts. There were spirits in mountains, trees, wells, forests, you name it. The gods and goddesses, like many shamanic cultures. There are lots of records of people doing spirit travel, so traveling in the other world. There, legends of somebody could travel across Ireland in a single day in spirit form, or people dropping into sleep and then, or trance and coming out and speaking poetry from the gods or what have you. These are all very, very shamanic things, even though they might not be recognized by some as that. So I'm not... I absolutely won't get into any internet arguments with anyone ever, particularly about whether there's cultural appropriation or people are importing stuff and, whatever. I'll say this. There are a lot of people who are really interested in going back to their pre-Christian roots. So, for example, there are a lot of neo-pagans in all over the world, particularly people who identify with Celtic neo-paganism or Norse neo-paganism or what have you, some other group or pantheon or ethnicity. All of those traditions have to be somewhat reconstructed, because we don't fully know. There aren't, most of these cultures passed spiritual knowledge orally. We only have these flawed writings that were either written by people who were trying to repress these pagans, or some archaeological evidence of specific ceremonies. I don't think anybody is out there saying, oh, well, some Celtic tribes were headhunters and, if the crops were bad, would sacrifice their king and throw him in a bog. I don't think anybody's doing that today. So I hope not anyway. And I don't think, and I don't think it's a bad thing. This is not pejorative. This is not in any way putting down anyone's individual spiritual practice. But I don't think anybody is practicing pure Celtic paganism, because how could you? You're practicing some form of reconstruction. You might be getting individual revelation or personal gnosis, and that's fantastic. That's really, to me, that's really the important thing. And if it helps you feel more connected with your culture, with people that, your ancestors, even better. It's fantastic. I have no issues with reconstructive work for people who want to go back, because it's the best option, because it's the only option in some cases, because we're not going back to the times of human sacrifice. We're not going to say, oh, well, the archaeological evidence doesn't support this, or only supports this, or the writings of the Romans only support this, but the Greeks disagreed and wrote this. So those arguments are tiresome, so I won't have them. Feel free amongst yourselves, and I know academics might have spirited debate about the roots of things and the history of things and the archaeology of things and the anthropology of things and DNA research and linguistic research and all of those things. And that's great. And I think that plays an important role as well. But I just think anybody out there who's saying there were no Celtic people practicing what we would consider shamanism, that is untrue. I think people saying that the historic record doesn't support shamanic practice is probably, depends on what you consider historic record, but probably also untrue. And, again, we can debate the definition of the word shamanism, but the way that I use it and the way most academics use it applies to a lot of different cultures, including Celtic culture. I hope this has not been offensive to anyone. I love you all. I love my brothers and sisters, and we are all brothers and sisters, particularly if you are from Celtic parts of the world. I feel my kinship to you. wear a kilt on, whenever I can in honor of my in honor of my ancestors. Um, so I hope this is helpful. Again, it's not my intention to get into an argument with anybody, and I won't. I won't argue, and I'm not academic enough to debate this. I just, have done. I have done. I hate this phrase. I've done my own research. I've looked at scholarly articles. I've read lots of books written by anthropologists, and will continue to research. My mind could be changed if somebody presented better information that was different. I try to approach everything with an open mind, and I hope you do the same. Hope this has been helpful. I hope you're happy and healthy, and stay safe out there. Be careful. I just got my COVID booster shot, so I'm here to tell you that shamanically, getting vaccinated is totally fine. I've done the journeys. It's safe and healthy. It's the right thing to do. It is take it as a civic duty. Anyway, I will talk to you real soon, and stay well.